In this video, I'm going to briefly run through a couple of examples from a recent assignment that really highlight this tip that I'm going to give you today around IRAC problem solving, and in particular in relation to the application section of your response. And that tip, generally speaking, is that you really need to directly apply those legal principles. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. Okay, so with this first example here, what we have is what I see as a very, competently put together application section. It does everything it needs to do. And the reason why is that the student here is directly applying those legal principles. It's very clear what principles they're applying in their application. So there's that connection or consistency between their law section and now their application section. So here, this was a consideration issue, and in particular, a past consideration issue. And if we have a look here, okay, the student mentions the lack of a promise, and we have the word consideration there, okay? We're applying it to those facts. Then here, okay, we've got quick restatement of the law, which didn't necessarily need to be done, but it didn't harm their response. Okay, then the next thing, here's where we have the information that links it to the past consideration principles that they'd outlined in the previous paragraph. Okay, so here's the promise. Here's the fact that it came before. The consideration came before the promise was made. Here's the student applying the key authority, and here's the student confirming or reiterating that in this particular scenario, this particular promise involves past performance, which is not good consideration. So in this paragraph here, the student has made it exceptionally clear that we're in the realm of consideration. They've outlined the relevant facts to that issue, okay? And they've made it very clear what sub-principles they're applying, which is the past consideration rule. So they've done everything they need to do here. It's very, very direct and clear what law they're applying to the facts. All right, so let's have a look at our next example. Okay, in this example here, we see a little bit more confusion in the application. Okay, so we've got the facts around the giving of the painting, which are the facts around that consideration issue. We've got the student mentioning that the consideration came before the offer, to give her the painting. Then it seems to go a little bit pear-shaped for the students. The student is coming to the right conclusion. They're in the right ballpark here, okay? The offer is gratuitous. It's a gratuitous promise. It's not enforceable. Okay, with no exchange of value. But just stating that there's no exchange of value is not the same as stating that these tutoring lessons amounted to past consideration. Now, I know this student knows this. Okay, I know they know this because they're drawing upon the right facts, but what they haven't done is marry those facts sufficiently to the legal principles. So they're in the right ballpark, but they're not quite kicking it out of the park. Is that kicking the ball out of the park? Whatever that analogy is, okay? They're in the right zone, but they're not in those upper mark ranges for this application. A further problem that exists with this particular example is that the student has brought in another area of law. Now, there was an intention to create legal relations issue in this particular scenario, but the student, by mentioning it in the same sentence as the offer being gratuitous, which was essentially came after them talking about the tutoring occurring in the past, what they've kind of done here is marry the consideration discussion and brought in a new area of law. And then what they haven't done is applied the relevant principles for that area of law, which was around the domestic presumption. So they're in the right ballpark for the consideration issue. They've brought in an area which is really a separate issue, and then they've missed application for that. So it's their application ends up a little bit confused, and it's not super direct in their application of the relevant principles. So that's that example 2. In terms of example 3 here, so this moved on to a different part of the scenario. Okay, let's have a read. So both Annie and Dario were aware letters and post would be an acceptable form of communication. As such, any form of postal acceptance was valid in their agreement. Now, this student has discussed relevant facts and they've come up with a conclusion. However, they haven't made it super clear what area of law they're applying. And essentially here they needed to have applied the reasonable, authorised, contemplated principle from Henthorne and Fraser. Okay, so the reason why the postal acceptance rule would apply in a particular scenario. So what we have then is the student is in the right ballpark-ish in the sense that they've identified relevant facts and they've stated a conclusion, but they haven't actually made that step, that additional step to then say, okay, well, it's acceptable form of communication, and what does that mean? Well, that means that communication was reasonable, authorised, or contemplated. So they haven't used those words of the test, and because of that, that discussion of the facts isn't really elevated to being an application of legal principles. So that's those first 2 lines here. Then what the student has done is moved on to the secondary issue, which is around the withdrawal of a postal acceptance. Now, the problem here is that the student has done the same thing in the sense that they've put forward facts which are relevant to that particular sub-issue. I know they know what the issues in this scenario are, and they've mentioned the timing of the revocation. But what the student hasn't done here is applied the 2 competing authorities around this issue. So they needed to have looked at the principle in Dunmore and Alexander, they needed to have looked at the principle in Wenkheim and Arndt, and they needed to have, like in the previous section, in the law section, then they needed to have directly applied these 2 conflicting lines of authority. Okay, so here's the fact about the withdrawal, the potential withdrawal by speedy means, and then here's what here's what the principle, the outcome would be if this authority is applied, and here's what the outcome would be if this other authority was applied. And then to be able to get into those upper mark ranges, the student would then have needed to have talked about which authority they found more persuasive, because the law is unsettled on this issue in Australia. So they're in the right factual area, but they're not systematically applying the legal principles they needed to get into those upper mark ranges, and then also develop that position on which line of authority they found more persuasive. Okay. And now with the final example, the problem in this example is a little bit different to the others, so but it's not that unusual with people who are problem solving for the first time to make this error. There'll always be a couple of students usually in a cohort who do this. What we've got here is the student has used application as their heading, so they've used issue, rule, application, conclusion as their headings. And what they've done in the section before, in the law section, they had dot points. From memory, I think that's what happened. Either that or a very brief statement of law. And then what they've done in their application section is had their law section, essentially. So here, well, at the start, they've actually got an issue statement, so that doesn't belong in this section. Then they're outlining the relevant principles. Okay, then we've got more principles down here, 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 and more principles down here. And what we don't have is any application of those principles to the facts. So the student has just, they've got the right content across their assignment, but I would guess that the earlier sections are quite brief and or repetitive. And then in this section, this is where their response really started, because that's, they've started with an issue statement there. But unfortunately what that means is that they haven't done what they needed to do in an actual application section, which was to apply these rules that they've outlined here to the facts. Okay, so yeah, so there's some examples from a recent assignment, and I guess the key thing I wanted you to take away from these examples is that, you know, your application sections don't necessarily need to be super complicated, but what they do need to do is to directly apply that law to the facts, and it needs to be clear when reading that paragraph that you are applying these specific principles. So be as direct as possible in your application of law to facts. Okay, thank you everyone.